They thought she was nothing but a discarded housewife, a stepping stone. When Richard walked into that courtroom wearing a $5,000 suit and holding the hand of his mistress, he expected a slaughter. He expected to leave Clara with nothing but the clothes on her back and a broken heart. He mocked her silence. He laughed at her empty bank account. But Richard made one fatal mistake. He didn't check who Clara really was before he married her. He didn't know that the woman sitting quietly at the defendant's table wasn't praying for mercy. She was waiting for the perfect moment to drop a nuclear bomb that would shake the entire city. This isn't just a divorce, it's an execution. The fluorescent lights of the brooding Manhattan courtroom buzzed with a low, irritating hum, matching the migraine that had been throbbing behind Clara's eyes for 3 hours. Outside, the grey sleet of a New York winter battered the windows, but inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly hot. "Your Honor, frankly, this is a waste of the court's valuable time," the lawyer sneered. Jameson Banks was exactly the kind of attorney men like Richard hired. He was slick, wore a pinstripe suit that cost more than Clara's car, and had a smile that didn't reach his cold, predatory eyes. He paced in front of Judge Whitmore's bench, gesturing theatrically toward Clara, as if she were a piece of gum stuck to the bottom of his shoe. "My client, Mr. Richard Dalton, has been more than generous," Banks continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "He has offered Ms. Mitchell a settlement of $20,000 to help her get back on her feet. Considering she contributed absolutely nothing to the marital assets during their 5-year marriage, we believe this is an act of charity, not obligation." At the plaintiff's table, Richard Dalton leaned back in his leather chair, checking his Rolex Daytona. He didn't even look at Clara. Beside him sat Tiffany, his 24-year-old assistant-turned-fiancée. Tiffany was popping chewing gum quietly, scrolling through Instagram on her phone, clearly bored by the dismantling of another woman's life. Clara sat alone at the defendant's table. She wore a simple charcoal blouse and black slacks, clothes that had seen better days. Her hands were folded neatly on the empty table in front of her. She had no lawyer. She had told the court clerk she would be representing herself, a decision that had drawn a pitying shake of the head from the bailiff earlier that morning. "Ms. Mitchell," Judge Whitmore's voice boomed, cutting through the heavy air. He was an older man with thick glasses and a hairline that had retreated decades ago. He looked tired. "Do you have any response to Mr. Banks's statement? The plaintiff is arguing for a summary dissolution based on the prenuptial agreement you signed. They are claiming you brought 0 assets into the marriage and are entitled to 0 assets exiting it." Clara stood up slowly. Her legs felt heavy, but her face remained impassive. "I hear them, Your Honor." Richard snorted loud enough for the microphone to catch it. "She hears us. Great defense, Clara. Maybe if you'd listened this well when I told you to get a job, we wouldn't be here." "Mr. Dalton, silence," the judge warned, though his tone lacked real bite. He turned back to Clara. "Ms. Mitchell, I am inclined to grant the motion. The prenuptial agreement is clear. You waived rights to Mr. Dalton's business, his real estate holdings in the Hamptons, and his investment portfolio. Unless you can prove financial duress or hidden assets, I have to rule in his favor." Banks smirked, buttoning his suit jacket. "There are no hidden assets, Your Honor. My client runs Dalton Tech, a transparent public company. Ms. Mitchell, on the other hand, spent 5 years spending my client's money on, well, I'm not sure what she did all day. Gardening? Reading romance novels?" Tiffany giggled, covering her mouth with a perfectly manicured hand. "Shopping at Target, probably," she whispered loudly. Clara turned her head. For the first time all morning, she looked directly at Richard. Her eyes were dark, unreadable pools. "I wasn't shopping, Richard," Clara said, her voice soft but steady. "I was building you." Richard laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Building me? You? Clara, you can't even balance a checkbook. I built Dalton Tech. I made the deals. I secured the contracts with the Defense Department. You just made the coffee." "Is that what you think?" Clara asked. "That's what I know," Richard shot back, standing up now, his ego taking over the courtroom. "You were a charity case, Clara. I picked you up from that diner you were waitressing at in Brooklyn. I gave you a life, a penthouse on Park Avenue, drivers, galas. And how did you repay me? By being boring, by dragging me down." He turned to the judge, spreading his arms wide. "Your Honor, finalize this, please. Let me move on to a woman who actually matches my stature." He placed a hand on Tiffany's shoulder. Judge Whitmore sighed, picking up his gavel. "Ms. Mitchell, unless you have substantial evidence to present right now, I am ruling in favor of the plaintiff. Judgment for Richard Dalton. 0 alimony. You have 30 days to vacate the secondary property in Queens." The gavel raised. "Wait," Clara said. It wasn't a scream. It was a command. The judge paused, the gavel hovering in the air. "Ms. Mitchell, do not test my patience." Clara reached into her battered tote bag. The sound of a zipper opening echoed in the silent room. Richard rolled his eyes. "What is she doing? Pulling out a coupon?" Clara pulled out a single, thick blue folder. It wasn't the standard manila folder used in low-rent legal battles. It was bound in heavy, textured cardstock, stamped with a gold seal that shimmered under the courtroom lights. The seal was an intricately designed crest, a lion rampant, holding a golden key. Attorney Banks froze. His smile evaporated instantly. He knew that crest. Every high-end lawyer in New York knew that crest. It belonged to the Montgomery Hastings Trust, one of the oldest, most secretive, and most powerful private equity groups in the Western Hemisphere. "I would like to submit piece of evidence A," Clara said, her voice changing. The softness was gone. In its place was the steel of a woman who had been trained since birth to command boardrooms. "And I would like to call a recess for 10 minutes so Mr. Banks can call his senior partners and explain why he just insulted the majority shareholder of his law firm." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the ventilation system. Richard looked confused. He squinted at the folder in Clara's hand. "What the hell is that? Did you print a logo off the internet?" But Jameson Banks wasn't speaking. He was pale. He took a hesitant step toward the defendant's table. "Ms. Mitchell, that seal—" "It's authentic, Mr. Banks," Clara said coolly, sliding the folder across the mahogany table toward the bailiff. "You can verify the watermarks. While you're at it, check the signature on the bottom of the deed to the building we are currently standing in." Judge Whitmore frowned, looking over his spectacles. "Ms. Mitchell, what is the meaning of this? What does a private equity firm have to do with your divorce?" "Everything, Your Honor," Clara said. She walked around the table, her posture shifting. She no longer looked like the defeated wife. She moved with the predatory grace of a panther. "Mr. Dalton claims I brought 0 assets into this marriage. He claims I was a waitress he saved. That was a partial truth. I was working as a waitress." She turned to Richard. "Do you remember why I was working at that diner, Rick?" Richard stammered, his arrogance faltering in the face of her sudden confidence. Because you were broke. You had just dropped out of community college." "No," Clara corrected. "I was working there because my grandfather, Alistair Montgomery, believed that before I could inherit the family seat, I needed to understand the value of $1. I was on a 2-year hiatus from my responsibilities to live as a normal person. That's when I met you." Tiffany leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "Rick, who is Alistair Montgomery?" Banks whipped his head around, snapping at Tiffany. "Shut up!" Richard recoiled. "Excuse me. You don't talk to her like—" "I said shut up!" Banks hissed, sweat beading on his forehead. He looked at Clara with terrified eyes. "Alistair Montgomery founded Montgomery Hastings. They own everything. They own the bank that holds your mortgage, Richard. They own the pharmaceutical company you're trying to merge with. They own this courthouse's land lease." Clara nodded. "Correct. And when I married you, Richard, I didn't sign your prenuptial agreement because I was poor. I signed it to protect myself from you." She signaled to the bailiff to hand the folder to the judge. "Inside that folder, Your Honor, you will find the real financials," Clara stated. "Mr. Dalton believes his tech company is worth $40 million, a respectable sum. However, the document you are holding proves that I personally injected $12 million of seed capital into Dalton Tech 5 years ago through a shell company called Blue Heron Ventures. I didn't just make the coffee, Richard. I funded the company." Richard's face turned a violent shade of red. "That's a lie. Blue Heron is a venture capital group out of Zurich. I met their rep." "You met my proxy," Clara said, leaning against the railing, crossing her arms. "I approved every tranche of funding while you were asleep next to me. I reviewed every contract you signed. I even rewrote your pitch deck for the Defense Department contract while you were out playing golf." Judge Whitmore was flipping through the pages, his eyes widening with every turn. "Good God," he muttered. "These are certified bank letters from the Cayman Islands. The trust fund alone. The trust triggers upon my 30th birthday," Clara said. "Or," she paused, a cruel smile touching her lips, "upon the legal dissolution of my marriage." She took a step toward Richard. He was gripping the table so hard his knuckles were white. "You wanted a divorce, Rick. You wanted to humiliate me. You wanted to show the world how powerful you are by kicking a poor waitress to the curb." Clara's voice dropped to a whisper that carried to the back of the room. "Well, you got your wish. The marriage is over, which means my assets are no longer frozen by the family covenant. I am now the sole executrix of the Montgomery estate." She looked at Banks. "Mr. Banks, as of this morning, I have instructed my board to review the lease agreement for your law firm's offices on 5th Avenue. I believe the rent is about to triple." Banks looked like he was going to vomit. He shoved his papers into his briefcase. "Your Honor, I request a recess. I need to consult with my client." "No recess!" Richard shouted, slamming his fist down. "This is insane! She's lying! She's a waitress! She buys her clothes at Goodwill." "I bought my clothes at Goodwill," Clara interrupted, "because I was saving my allowance to buy out your competitors." She turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, since Mr. Dalton was so eager to enforce the prenup, let's look at Clause 14, Section B, the Infidelity Clause. It states that if either party is proven to be unfaithful, the division of shared assets shifts." Richard scoffed nervously. "You can't prove anything. Tiffany and I only got together after we separated." Clara raised an eyebrow. She pulled a small USB drive from her pocket and set it gently on the table. "I have the security footage from your office, Richard, from 3 years ago. The dates are time-stamped. I also have the receipts from the hotel in Cabo, where you took Tiffany for her 21st birthday, while I was at home, nursing your mother through chemotherapy." The room went dead silent. Even Tiffany looked down, shame flushing her cheeks. Richard's jaw dropped. You knew?" Richard whispered. For 3 years. I knew, Clara said. I waited. I waited for the merger with the Defense Department to go through so the company valuation would peak. I waited for you to file the paper so you would look like the aggressor. And I waited for today. She checked her own watch, a battered Timex. It's 10:15 a.m. My lawyers just filed a hostile takeover bid for Dalton Tech. Since I own the debt through Blue Heron Ventures, and you just admitted in open court that the company is your sole asset. Clara smiled, and for the first time it was genuine. It was terrifying. I'm calling in the debt, Richard. Immediate repayment. $45 million. Do you have it? Richard slumped into his chair. He looked at Banks. Banks looked at the floor. If you don't have it, Clara said, then Dalton Tech belongs to me. The walk from the defendant's table to the heavy oak doors of the courtroom felt like a coronation procession, though Clara walked it alone. Behind her, the chaos was palpable. Richard was screaming at Jameson Banks, his voice cracking with a mixture of adolescent rage and genuine terror. The judge was still banging his gavel, trying to restore order to a room that had fundamentally shifted its axis. Clara pushed the doors open. The hallway, usually a place of quiet murmurs and anxious pacing, was empty. She took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of floor wax and old paper. It was the smell of victory. Waiting for her at the end of the corridor was a man in a sharp navy suit. He stood 6'4", built like a linebacker, but holding himself with the stillness of a statue. This was Preston, the head of her personal security detail, a man she hadn't been allowed to acknowledge publicly for 5 years. Ms. Mitchell, Preston said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't smile, but his eyes held a glimmer of respect. The car is waiting out back. The press is out front. Mr. Dalton's publicist must have tipped them off earlier, expecting a victory lap. Let them wait, Clara said, adjusting the strap of her tote bag. Did you secure the servers? The team locked down the Dalton Tech server room at 10:00 a.m. sharp, Preston confirmed as they walked toward the private elevator. We cut remote access. Richard's credentials have been revoked. The board of directors is assembling in the main conference room as we speak. They are anxious to meet the new majority owner. Clara nodded. Good. Let's go. Downstairs, they bypassed the swarm of reporters, hungry for a shot of the disgraced wife, and slipped into the back of a black armored SUV. As the door thudded shut, sealing out the noise of the city, Clara finally allowed her shoulders to drop. She pulled her phone out. It had been turned off for the duration of the hearing. When she powered it on, it nearly vibrated out of her hand. 57 missed calls. 40 of them were from Richard. 10 from Tiffany. 7 from numbers she didn't recognize. Likely Richard's loyal employees realizing their paychecks were now in her hands. She watched the city blur by through the tinted windows. They were heading toward the financial district, to the gleaming glass tower that housed Dalton Tech. Richard had chosen that building because it looked powerful. It was all chrome and glass, designed to intimidate. He loved looking down on the city. He used to stand by the window in his office, swirling a glass of scotch, and tell Clara, "This is what success looks like, babe. You wouldn't understand. You're happy with coupons and casseroles." She had bitten her tongue then. She wouldn't bite it now. 20 minutes later, the SUV pulled up to the curb of the Dalton Tower. But they weren't the only ones arriving. A bright red Porsche screeched to a halt right behind them, mounting the curb illegally. Richard Dalton burst out of the driver's side, his expensive suit disheveled, his tie undone. He looked wild-eyed. He sprinted toward the revolving doors, ignoring the valet who tried to take his keys. Clara watched him run. "Wait," she told the driver. "Let him get to the realization on his own." She watched as Richard slammed his hand against the security turnstile in the lobby. He swiped his badge. Nothing. He swiped it again, harder. The light remained a stubborn, unforgiving red. He started shouting at the security guard, a man named Jerry, whom Richard had fired twice and rehired at lower pay just for the power trip. Jerry stood behind the desk, his arms crossed, shaking his head. "It's time," Clara said. Preston opened her door. Clara stepped out onto the pavement. The wind whipped her hair, but she didn't care. She walked into the lobby of the building she had secretly paid for. As she entered, the sound of Richard's screaming filled the high-ceilinged atrium. "I am the CEO of this company," Richard was yelling, spit flying from his mouth. "Jerry, I swear to God, if you don't override this gate, I will have you arrested for obstruction. Open it!" "He can't open it, Richard," Clara said, her voice cutting through the noise like a razor. Richard spun around. He looked at Clara, then at the security guards flanking her. His eyes darted to the receptionist, the delivery guys, the other employees gathering by the elevators. They were all watching. "You," Richard breathed, stepping toward her. "You did this. You hacked my system." "I didn't hack anything," Clara said calmly, walking up to the turnstile. She didn't pull out a badge. She simply looked at Jerry. "Good morning, Jerry. How is your daughter's recovery going?" Jerry, the man Richard treated like furniture, smiled warmly at Clara. "She's doing much better, Ms. Mitchell. Thank you for the specialist you recommended." "Please unlock the gate, Jerry." "Yes, ma'am." Jerry pressed a button. The gates slid open smoothly with a welcoming chime. Clara stepped through. Richard tried to follow her, but Preston stepped in his path, a wall of muscle in a suit. "Miss Mitchell is attending a board meeting," Preston said. "You are not on the list." "It's my board," Richard shrieked. "I appointed them." Clara paused and turned back. "Actually, Richard, you appointed 3 of them. I appointed the other 4 through shell corporations. And the 3 you appointed, they're currently looking at the audit of your expense account I sent them, the one detailing the corporate funds you used for Tiffany's apartment." Richard went pale. That was a loan. "It was embezzlement," Clara corrected. "Preston, escort Mr. Dalton to the elevator. He can come up to the conference room, but only to collect his personal effects." "I'm not done," Richard yelled, as Preston took him by the arm, not gently. "You can't just steal my company. I'm the visionary. I'm the face of Dalton Tech." Clara stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the penthouse floor. As the doors closed, framing Richard's desperate red face, she offered him one last piece of advice. "The face can be changed, Richard. It's the brain that matters." The elevator ride to the 40th floor was silent, but Clara's mind was loud. She was replaying the last 5 years. She remembered the nights she sat up, fixing Richard's code while he slept, letting him believe he had solved the bugs in his dreams. She remembered the dinner parties, where she played the doting, simple wife, listening to his friends make jokes about her lack of education, all while she was mentally calculating the ROI of their failing startups. She had done it for love, or what she thought was love. She had wanted to be loved for Clara, not for the Montgomery billions. She wanted to know that a man wanted her heart, not her checkbook. Richard had failed that test so spectacularly, it was almost impressive. The elevator dinged. The doors opened directly into the boardroom. It was a vast room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson River. Sitting around the long glass table were the 7 members of the board of directors. Usually, when Clara entered this building, on the rare occasions Richard allowed her to visit, she was greeted with dismissive nods or asked to fetch coffee. Today, all 7 directors stood up. "Ms. Mitchell," said Mr. Henderson, the chairman. He was a stern man who had never looked Clara in the eye before. Now, he looked like he was afraid to blink. "Please, take a seat." He gestured to the head of the table. Richard's chair. Clara walked over and sat down. The leather was still warm, a ghost of the man who used to rule here. She placed the blue folder on the table. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson," she said. "I assume you've reviewed the documents?" "We have," Henderson said, his voice tight. "The hostile takeover bid from Blue Heron Ventures is airtight. The debt call creates an immediate liquidity crisis. Technically, the company is insolvent as of this morning." "Unless," Clara prompted, "unless the debt holder, you, agrees to a restructuring plan," Henderson finished, "which effectively gives you total controlling interest." Just then, the double doors burst open. Richard stumbled in, shrugging off Preston's grip. He looked around the room, panting. He saw Clara in his chair. He saw the board member standing respectfully. "Get up," Richard snarled, marching toward her. "Get out of my chair." "Sit down, Richard," Henderson snapped. Richard froze. He looked at Henderson, his biggest ally. "Bill, what are you doing? Tell her to leave. She's having a psychotic break. She's a waitress." "She owns the debt, Richard," Henderson said, throwing a stack of papers onto the table. "And she owns the evidence of your fraud." Richard looked at the papers. He saw the bank transfers, the consulting fees paid to Tiffany, the vacations written off as business development. "Everyone does that," Richard argued, his voice rising to a high pitch. "It's standard practice." "It's a felony when you're doing it with borrowed money," Clara said calmly. "Specifically, money borrowed from my trust." She leaned forward, lacing her fingers together. "Here is the situation, Richard. I can hand these files to the SEC and the district attorney. You will go to prison for perhaps 5 to 7 years. Dalton Tech will be dissolved, its assets sold for parts." Richard gripped the back of a chair to steady himself. The fight was draining out of him, replaced by a cold, dawning horror. "Or," he whispered. "Or," Clara continued, "you sign over your remaining 15% equity to me. You resign immediately as CEO. You sign a non-disclosure agreement stating you left for health reasons, and you walk away with nothing. No prison, but no company, no money, no reputation." Richard looked around the room. He looked at the faces of the men and women he thought were his friends. They were all looking at Clara. They had already picked the winner. "You can't do this," Richard cried, tears actually forming in his eyes now. "I built this. I am the genius behind the Sentinel project. The Defense Department deal. That was me. Without me, you can't deliver the code." Clara laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. "The Sentinel project?" she asked. "Richard, you haven't written a line of viable code since 2019. The Sentinel architecture, I wrote it." "Liar!" "Did you ever wonder why the code compiled perfectly on Tuesday mornings?" Clara asked softly. "You played poker on Monday nights. I stayed home. I went into your laptop. I fixed your mess. I optimized the algorithms. The genius you're so proud of. It's me. It's always been me." She tapped her temple. "The IP is in my head, Richard, not yours. If you leave, the company survives. If I leave, this company is a room full of expensive computers and zero intelligence." Richard stared at her. He looked like he was seeing a stranger. The quiet, mousy woman he had bullied for 5 years was gone. In her place was a titan. "Why?" Richard asked, his voice breaking. "If you had all this money, all this power, why did you let me treat you like trash? Why did you scrub the floors? Why did you let me humiliate you?" Clara stood up. She walked around the table until she was standing inches from him. "Because I wanted to see if you were worth saving. she said quietly. I wanted to see if, stripped of the glamour and the money, there was a decent man inside you. A man who could love a partner, not a prop. She leaned in close. I gave you 5 years to show me 1 ounce of kindness, Richard. Just 1. And you gave me nothing but contempt. She turned back to the table. Sign the papers, Richard, or I call the police. You have 1 minute. Richard looked at the pen lying on the document. His hand shook. He looked at Tiffany, who was standing in the doorway, watching. She looked disgusted, not at Clara, but at him. He was a loser now, and Tiffany didn't date losers. With a trembling hand, Richard picked up the pen. He signed his name. He signed away his legacy, his fortune, and his pride. Done, he choked out. Are you happy? Clara picked up the paper, checking the signature. Preston, please escort the former CEO out of the building and revoke his parking pass. As Preston dragged a sobbing Richard out of the room, Clara didn't look back. She turned to the board. Now, she said, her voice brisk and professional. Let's talk about the Q4 projections. I have some ideas on how to clean up the mess my predecessor left behind. But just as the meeting was settling in, the door opened again. It wasn't Richard. It was a woman. She was tall, elegant, wearing a suit that cost more than Richard's car. She had silver hair and eyes that matched Clara's perfectly. It was Clara's grandmother, the matriarch of the Montgomery family, Beatrice Montgomery. She walked in with a cane that looked like a weapon. The board members gasped. Seeing Beatrice Montgomery in person was like seeing the Queen. Grandmother, Clara said, surprised. I didn't expect you. Beatrice stopped in the center of the room. She looked at Clara, then at the empty chair where Richard had sat. You handled the boy well, Clara, Beatrice said, her voice icy. But you've made a mistake. Clara frowned. I have control of the company. I have the IP. What mistake? Beatrice threw a newspaper onto the table. The headline wasn't about the divorce. It was about a fire. While you were playing courtroom drama, Beatrice said, someone firebombed the server farm in New Jersey, the backup data center for Dalton Tech. Clara's blood ran cold. The backups? But if the backups are gone, and you just locked Richard out of the local servers, Beatrice said, which means the system triggered a failsafe. If the local servers are locked and the backups are destroyed, the data wipes, Clara whispered. It's a security protocol I wrote myself. Exactly, Beatrice said grimly. You just won a company that is currently deleting its own brain. You have about 2 hours before Dalton Tech is worth $0. And Richard? He just texted me. He knows. Clara looked at her phone. A message from Richard, sent 1 minute ago. You might have the money, Clara, but I know where the manual override key is. And it's not in the building. Do you want to make a deal? The war wasn't over. It had just moved to a new battlefield. Beatrice Montgomery did not sit. She stood by the window of the boardroom, her silhouette framed against the grey skyline of Manhattan, watching the invisible digital fire consume her granddaughter's inheritance. You have 89 minutes, Beatrice said, her voice devoid of sympathy. I had my analysts check the server logs on the way up. The protocol that triggered isn't standard. It's aggressive. It's rewriting the binary with zeros. It's not just deleting files, Clara. It's salting the earth. Clara was typing furiously on Richard's laptop, her fingers flying across the keys. Sweat beaded on her forehead. It's the Ouroboros protocol, she muttered, her eyes scanning lines of red code scrolling down the screen. I wrote it 3 years ago. I was afraid Richard would try to sell the source code to the Chinese or Russians behind my back. I designed it, so that if the system detected an external lockdown without a specific cryptographic key, it would assume the company had been compromised by foreign state actors and self-destruct. Mr. Henderson, the board chairman, looked like he was about to faint. You built a suicide switch into a billion-dollar company? I built a shield, Clara snapped, not looking up. I didn't think I'd be the one locked out. The system needs 2 keys to abort the wipe. The founder's key, which I have. She tapped a sequence on her phone, and a green light blinked on the screen. And the executive key. The physical hardware token I gave to Richard when he became CEO. The little black USB drive he wears on his keychain? Henderson asked. He calls it his good luck charm. He never takes it off. Clara slammed the laptop shut. That charm contains a shifting 256-bit encryption key. Without it, I can't stop Ouroboros. If I try to hack my own code, the system accelerates the wipe. We lose everything. The Defense Department contracts, the Sentinel AI, the patent portfolio. Dalton Tech becomes a shell company worth nothing. Then pay him, Beatrice commanded, turning from the window. Richard wants a deal. Give him $5 million. Give him 10. It is cheaper than losing the entire asset. It's not about the money anymore, Clara said, standing up. Richard is petty. If he knows he can hurt me, he'll burn the company down just to watch me choke on the smoke. He's probably halfway to the airport. No, Preston interrupted. The head of security was looking at a tablet. He's not at the airport. I've been tracking his vehicle's transponder. He drove straight to Queens. Clara froze. Queens? To the secondary property. He's been stationary there for 10 minutes, Preston confirmed. Clara grabbed her coat. That doesn't make sense. He hates that apartment. He calls it the rat hole. It's where we lived when we were first married, before the funding came through. Why would he go there? Perhaps he is feeling sentimental, Beatrice said dryly. Or perhaps he is setting a trap. I don't care what it is, Clara said, heading for the door. I need that key. Preston, you're driving. We have to get to Queens in less than 40 minutes, or the colonel gets wiped. I'm coming with you, Henderson said, standing up. No, Clara ordered. You stay here. Keep the shareholders calm. Tell them it's a scheduled maintenance downtime. That's a lie, Henderson stammered. That's business, Mr. Henderson, Clara said. Welcome to the big leagues. The drive to Queens was a blur of sirens and aggressive maneuvering. Preston drove the armored SUV like a tank, forcing taxis onto the shoulder as they wove through the midday traffic. In the back seat, Clara watched the countdown on her phone. Time remaining, 58 minutes. Data integrity, 82%. Every percentage point drop represented millions of dollars of research vanishing into the ether. Why did you marry him, Ms. Mitchell? Preston asked quietly from the front seat, his eyes on the road. It was the first personal question he had ever asked her. Clara looked out the window at the passing tenements. Because he needed me, Preston. My whole life, people only wanted me for the Montgomery name. They wanted the connections, the power. Richard, when I met him, he didn't know who I was. He was struggling. He was passionate. He looked at me and saw a partner, not a payday, or so I thought. Power reveals character, Preston said. It doesn't create it. I know that now, Clara whispered. He didn't change when he got rich. He just became free to be who he really was. The SUV screeched to a halt in front of a brick building in Astoria. It was a walk-up, unassuming and gritty. The fire escape was rusted, and graffiti covered the front door. It was a stark contrast to the glass tower they had just left. He's on the 4th floor, Preston said, checking his gun holstered beneath his jacket. Unit 4B. Do you want me to breach? No, Clara said, stepping out onto the wet pavement. If you kick down the door, he might flush the key or smash it. I have to talk him down. I have to make him believe he's won. I'll be right behind the door, Preston promised. One scream, and I'm coming in. Clara nodded and walked up the steps. The smell of the building, stale curry and damp plaster, hit her instantly. It smelled like her past. It smelled like the days when they ate ramen on the floor and dreamed of the future. She reached the door of 4B. It was unlocked. She pushed it open slowly. "Richard?" she called out. The apartment was dark. The blinds were drawn. The only light came from the street lamps outside, filtering through the slats. The furniture was draped in dust sheets. They hadn't been here in 3 years. "I'm in the kitchen, Clara," Richard's voice called out. It sounded slurred, thick. Clara walked down the narrow hallway. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. 45 minutes left. She stepped into the kitchen. Richard was sitting at the small, wobbly table where she used to balance their checkbook. A bottle of expensive scotch was open in front of him, half empty. He was holding the key. The small black USB drive. He was twirling it between his fingers. But he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the lighter in his other hand. "You came," Richard said, a lopsided grin on his face. "I knew you would. You can't resist a mess, can you? You always have to fix everything." "Give me the key, Richard," Clara said, keeping her voice even. "The company is dying. If that drive isn't plugged into the mainframe in 40 minutes, there is no company. No money for me, but no buyout for you either." "I don't care," Richard whispered. He flicked the lighter. A small flame danced dangerously close to the plastic casing of the USB drive. "I was thinking, Clara, about that prenup. You played me. You played me so good." "I protected myself," Clara said, stepping closer. "You were the one cheating, Richard. You were the one stealing." "I was the CEO," Richard roared, slamming his fist on the table. The bottle jumped. "I was the king. And you were just the quiet little wife. You made me look like a fool today, in front of Tiffany, in front of the city." "You did that to yourself," Clara said. "Richard, please, put out the lighter. Let's make a deal. You want money? I'll give you $5 million. Cash, wired to any account you want. Just give me the key." Richard paused. The flame wavered. $5 million? 10, Clara counted. $10 million. That's enough to start over. Enough to go to Europe, buy a villa, find a new Tiffany. Just hand it over. Richard looked at the key. Greed flickered in his eyes, warring with his pride. He lowered the lighter. $10 million, he muttered. "And an apology. I want you to apologize. Say you were a bad wife. Say you held me back." Clara swallowed the bile rising in her throat. She looked at the time on her watch. 38 minutes. Clara started. "I'm sorry, Richard. I held you back." Richard smiled, a cruel, satisfied smirk. "See? Was that so hard?" He reached out to hand her the key. Clara reached for it. Her fingertips grazed the cold metal. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the corner of the room. Click! The sound of a hammer cocking on a pistol echoed in the small kitchen. "Don't give her the key, Rick," a female voice said. Clara froze. Richard jumped, pulling his hand back. Stepping out of the pantry was Tiffany, but she didn't look like the bored, gum-chewing assistant from the courtroom. She was wearing tactical black cargo pants and a fitted jacket. Her hair was tied back severely, and in her hand she held a suppressed Glock 19, aimed directly at Clara's chest. "Tiffany?" Richard blinked, confused. "Babe, what are you doing with a gun?" "Shut up, you idiot," Tiffany said, her voice cold and professional. She looked at Clara. "Step away from him, Miss Mitchell. Hands where I can see them." The kitchen felt suddenly very small. The air was thick with the smell of stale scotch and gun oil. "Tiffany?" Clara asked, raising her hands slowly. Her mind was racing. "What is this?" "If you want money, Richard was just about to take the deal. 10 million covers you too." Tiffany laughed. It wasn't a giggle. It was a sharp, barking sound. 10 million? You think I slept with this narcissistic man-child for 3 years for $10 million? You Montgomerys really have no idea how much your secrets are worth. She walked closer, the gun never wavering. She moved with trained precision. She wasn't an assistant. She was an operator. "Who are you?" Clara demanded. "Does the name Ares Systems mean anything to you?" Tiffany asked. Clara felt a chill go down her spine. Ares, the defense contractor in Virginia, our main competitor for the Sentinel contract. "Bingo," Tiffany said. "My name is Agent Sarah Miller. I've been embedded with Dalton Tech for 4 years. My assignment was to acquire the source code for the Sentinel AI." Richard stood up, his mouth hanging open. "Embedded? Assignment? But we're getting married. You love me." Tiffany, Sarah, rolled her eyes. She pistol-whipped Richard across the face. It was a brutal, efficient strike. Richard crumpled to the floor, groaning, clutching his bleeding nose. The USB key skittered across the linoleum floor, sliding under the refrigerator. "I tolerated you," Tiffany spat at him. "You were easy, Rick. A massive ego, insecure, lazy, the perfect mark. I thought I could just copy the files from your laptop, but your wife here." She nodded at Clara. She locked everything down tight, encryption on top of encryption. I couldn't get the source code out. She turned the gun back to Clara. "I knew about the Ouroboros protocol. I knew if I triggered a hard alarm, the system would start wiping. And I knew you, Clara, would come running with the Founder's key to save your precious baby." Clara realized the horror of the situation. The firebombing. That was you. "A distraction," Tiffany confirmed. "I needed to force a crisis. I needed you to unlock the system. And now you're going to do exactly that." She pulled a ruggedized tablet from her bag and tossed it onto the table. "Use your Founder credentials," Tiffany ordered. "Remote into the mainframe. Stop the wipe, and then transfer the raw source code of Sentinel to the server address on that screen." "If I do that," Clara said, her voice shaking with controlled rage, "Ares Systems steals our technology. You'll patent it before we can recover. It destroys Dalton Tech just as surely as the wipe." "True," Tiffany shrugged. "But if you don't do it, I put a bullet in your kneecap, then the other one, then your stomach. You'll bleed out right here in this dirty kitchen, and the code wipes anyway. This way, you live. Penniless, maybe. But alive." Clara looked at the tablet. Then she looked at the refrigerator where the key was hidden. Then at the door. Preston was outside. But Tiffany was a pro. She would shoot before Preston could clear the room. "I need the physical key Richard dropped," Clara lied, "to authorize the transfer." "No, you don't," Tiffany sneered. "I know the architecture. The Founder's key can override the need for the executive key if you use the emergency root access. Do it. Now." She cocked her head. "You have 10 seconds." Clara stepped toward the tablet. She typed in her username. "User, Stacey Mitchell. Passcode, biometric scan required." "It needs my thumbprint," Clara said. "Press it," Tiffany ordered, stepping closer to ensure no tricks. Clara pressed her thumb to the screen. The system logged in. The red countdown bar filled the screen. Time remaining, 22 minutes. Status, critical. "Stop the wipe," Tiffany commanded. Clara's hand hovered over the abort button. "Richard!" Clara shouted suddenly. "The bottle!" On the floor, Richard, dazed and bleeding, looked up. His hand was resting near the dropped scotch bottle. Despite his cowardice, the realization that his fiancée was a corporate spy who had played him for a fool sparked a burst of desperate rage. Richard grabbed the bottle and swung it wildly at Tiffany's legs. It was a clumsy attack, but it was enough. The glass shattered against Tiffany's shin. She cried out in surprise, stumbling backward, the gun swaying for a fraction of a second. That was all Clara needed. Clara didn't go for the gun. She went for the coffee pot on the counter. A heavy, old-fashioned glass carafe, half filled with stagnant water. She grabbed it and hurled it at Tiffany's face. Tiffany ducked, the carafe smashing against the wall, but the distraction bought another second. "Preston!" Clara screamed. The front door exploded inward. The wood splintered as Preston kicked it open, his weapon already drawn. Tiffany spun around, raising her Glock. Bang! Bang! 2 shots rang out in the confined space. Tiffany dropped her gun, clutching her shoulder, spinning and falling against the cabinets. Preston moved in instantly, kicking the weapon away and pinning her to the ground with a knee to her back. "Secure!" Preston shouted. "Miss Mitchell, are you hit?" Clara was breathing hard, leaning against the table. "I'm fine, secure her." She looked down at Richard. He was curled up in a ball, covering his head, sobbing amidst the broken glass and spilled scotch. "Richard," Clara said sharply. He looked up, blood streaming from his nose. She shot me?" he whimpered, checking himself frantically. "She missed," Clara said. "Get up." She dropped to her knees and reached under the refrigerator. Her fingers closed around the cool plastic of the USB drive. "Got it," she whispered. She stood up and jammed the key into the side of the ruggedized tablet Tiffany had brought. She typed in her own password, then Richard's executive code, which she knew by heart because she had set it for him. Code 042918, their wedding anniversary. He hadn't even changed it. She hit enter. On the screen, the red bar froze. Time remaining, 18 minutes. Protocol aborted. Data restoration initiated. Clara slumped against the counter, the adrenaline crashing out of her system. The room was silent except for Richard's sniffling and the sound of Preston handcuffing Tiffany. "It's over," Clara said softly. "The code is safe." Richard crawled up, using the table for support. He looked at Tiffany, who was glaring at him from the floor. "You," Richard stammered at the spy. "You never loved me?" "Love you," Tiffany spat, wincing from her shoulder wound. "Richard, listening to you talk about yourself for 3 years was the hardest torture I've ever endured. You're a hollow man." Richard looked at Clara. He looked broken. The arrogance was gone. The visionary facade had been stripped away, leaving a terrified child. "Clara," he whispered, I saved you. I swung the bottle." Clara looked at him. Her eyes were sad, but clear. "You swung the bottle because she hurt your ego, Richard, not because you wanted to save me." She straightened her jacket. "Preston, call the police, and call the FBI. Corporate espionage is a federal crime. Sarah Miller is going away for a long time." "And him?" Preston asked, nodding at Richard. Clara looked at her ex-husband. He was covered in scotch, blood, and shame. "He signed the papers, Preston. He's nobody. Let him go." "Clara, wait!" Richard grabbed her hand. "Please, I have nothing. She played me. I was a victim too. Take me back. Or at least give me the job. I can be the face. I can change." Clara gently peeled his fingers off her sleeve. "The face of Dalton Tech is changing, Richard. Goodbye." She walked out of the apartment, stepping over the shattered glass, leaving the smell of the past behind her. She had a company to rebuild. 12 months later, the winter snow was falling on New York City again, coating the streets in a layer of pristine white. But inside the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, everything was gold. It was the annual Innovators of the Year gala. The room was packed with senators, celebrities, and tech moguls. Flashbulbs erupted like lightning storms as the guest of honor arrived. Clara Montgomery stepped onto the red carpet. She wore a midnight blue gown that shimmered under the lights, a stark contrast to the charcoal slacks she had worn in court a year ago. She wasn't alone. On her arm was the CEO of a rival European firm, a man who looked at her with genuine admiration, not calculation. Inside the ballroom, the giant screens displayed the new logo of her company, Montgomery Sentinel. After the RE Systems scandal and the arrest of Sarah Miller, alias Tiffany, the Defense Department had awarded the exclusive contract to Clara. Under her leadership, the company's valuation had tripled. She hadn't just saved the code, she had evolved it. Far away from the champagne and the applause, in a cramped electronics store in a strip mall in New Jersey, a man in a blue polo shirt was restocking phone chargers. Richard Dalton looked older. His hair was thinning, and the stress lines around his eyes were deep. He had filed for personal bankruptcy 6 months ago. No one in the tech world would hire him after the scandal. Now he managed the shift at Gadget World, earning slightly above minimum wage. He paused as he walked past the wall of televisions. They were all tuned to the gala coverage. "And here is the woman of the hour," the news anchor said. "Clara Montgomery, who turned a failing startup into a global empire." Richard stared at the screen. He watched Clara laugh at something the reporter said. She looked radiant, powerful, happy. "Hey, buddy," a customer grunted behind him, tapping a credit card on the counter. "Are you going to ring up these headphones or just stare at the TV?" Richard blinked, snapping back to his reality. He looked at the customer, a sudden desperation seizing him. He wanted to scream, "I know her! I built that! She was my wife!" That's my ex-wife," Richard muttered, pointing a shaking finger at the screen. The customer looked at the screen, saw the billionaire heiress, then looked back at the sad, tired man in the polyester shirt. "Yeah, right," the customer scoffed. "And I'm the King of England. Just ring up the headphones, pal." Richard lowered his head. "Yes, sir." On the screen, the reporter asked Clara one final question. "Ms. Montgomery, what is the secret to your success?" Clara looked directly into the camera. For a second, Richard felt like she was looking right at him across the miles of cable and regret. "Knowing your own worth," Clara said with a smile, "and never letting anyone discount it." Richard turned away from the screen as the applause roared. The sound of his own failure was deafening, and that is the story of how Richard Dalton learned the most expensive lesson of his life. Never mistake silence for weakness, and never judge a book or a wife by the cover. Clara didn't just win the court case, she won her freedom and reclaimed her destiny, proving that the best revenge isn't anger, it's absolute, undeniable success. What did you think of Clara's final move? Did Richard deserve to end up working at an electronics store, or was his punishment too harsh? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of karma and justice, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. We drop new dramas every week. Thanks for listening, and remember, be careful who you step on today, because they might be the one running the world tomorrow. See you in the next video.